Hello, my name is Garrison Gibbons, and I'm the head of people at Notch, a content intelligence platform based in New York City. We are around 60 people, and there I currently oversee HR management, recruiting, talent, and performance management. As a queer professional, I've had the pleasure of working both for companies where I felt like I truly belonged and where I was a token. And so, as a queer professional, I took it upon myself as I continued to work in the area of HR to really become a diversity, equity, and inclusion specialist. And so, this whole conversation today is about how to avoid the back burner and keep DEI a priority. This conversation is obviously taking place amidst a global pandemic, but it also takes place in a conversation around race and systemic racism in our country. And so diversity, equity, and inclusion, much like HR, have many people's attention right now. And this conversation is really about how to make sure that you're keeping diversity, equity, inclusion a priority, both whenever the pandemic and whenever the protests die down, but also as we continue to navigate and as more nuance and more life becomes normal in the workplace. Today, we're working remotely from our homes. We are showcasing more of ourselves and bringing more of our authentic selves to work than ever before. But we need to ensure that diverse and inclusive voices are being respected and that authenticity can really shine through as a result of the policies and procedures we put into place. So I'm really excited to dive deeply in here today. So let's start with why DEI is extremely important right now. Different groups are being affected by this crisis differently. We hear it in the media, but you can also see it in the numbers that Black and brown lives are being disproportionately affected to coronavirus. Also, when you look at health disparities between the LGBTQ community for one, to other communities, you see that health care in general is disproportionately affected to different minority groups. And so it's really important to make sure that you're centering your policies and processes to those groups and making sure that you're ensuring that those groups have proper care, proper resources during this time. Two, I think COVID in general has reminded us that it's important to reflect, and I think it's given us a time for reflecting, particularly as it relates to the Black community and the topic of systemic racism. But for me, being a part of hypergrowth startups a majority of my career, I've always been running 5,000 miles per hour. And this crisis has really forced all of us to slow down. You know, we're not going to triple in revenue this year. There's economic uncertainty. And so now we can really take the time, and we should take the time to really focus on some of these things that can quickly be put on the back burner just due to all the other fires that we need to put out. And so this crisis has created a real time for reflection. Three, preparation for work, whatever that looks like, post reintegration. You know, there will come a time where people are working in an office again, I fully believe. And while some companies will remain remote, I think we really have to prepare for what will we expect from our workplaces and what will workplaces have to give their employees once the dust settles and this is no longer a temporary issue and this is a long-term solution, whether that be you're going to be remote for the rest of your days or whether that be some hybrid of an office setup. There's no longer the excuse when we return to whatever normal is or whenever we finalize what normal is, there will be no excuse for not prioritizing diversity, equity, and inclusion. So the time to do that is now. I think this is a time where you really find out what companies value. You know, there is a lot of posturing going on. Companies naturally had to make some sort of external response, particularly consumer brands. And you've seen those work for some companies that really are fostering an area of inclusion and diversity, but you're seeing that fail with companies that maybe do have a lot of internal issues. And so I think the way in which a company responds and the way in which a company truly prioritizes this, not only when the attention is on them, but in the months to come when the attention naturally dies down, is going to be really important. And it's a chance for employees and prospective employees and talent to really see what a company values. The urgency has increased, but the importance remains the same. I was on a panel a few months ago and someone said this and it was so true. You know, DEI is no more urgent. It may be more urgent than it was, you know, a month ago or 2 months ago, but the importance has always been there. And for many in minority communities, it can be quite frustrating that the urgency is only happening now, or that many people only see this as a requirement now when we've been screaming into the void. And my Black and brown brothers and sisters have been screaming into a void even more so over the last several years. So just remember that while the importance does in fact remain the same, it can be acknowledged that the urgency has increased, but we need to remember that overall the importance has always been there, and you need to acknowledge the fact that if you haven't prioritized or valued this as important in the past, you need to do so now. So there's a lot that's happening that DEI, I feel, can truly and should truly be looped into. One, changes in process, remote work, any benefit changes, changes to different teams, the way in which they're structured, the way in which they operate, all should be looked at from the lens of diversity, equity, and inclusion. Expectations in the remote work environment, you need to think about parents, but you also need to think about how these minority groups are being disproportionately affected and how their work environment might be different, whether that be access to Wi-Fi, access to additional space. Our employees in New York City don't more than likely than not have an office. And so really being accountable to that, just thinking through in terms of the remote environment you're providing for your employees, is that equitable? And are you really being inclusive to that? Employee engagement and team morale. One thing I've spoken at length about to my friends and other DEI experts in the Black community is exhaustion and frustration that it's taken this long, that there are more Black lives being murdered, that there are countless times that this has been brought up to people's attention and it goes ignored. And there's a lot of rightful emotions going around. And so that naturally will impact and have some impact on the employee engagement and team morale. So really factoring in diversity, equity, inclusion, and ensuring that you're looking at a way to make your team and your culture more inclusive is extremely important. Performance, same thing. As people are naturally going through things in their personal lives, this change, both COVID and the reminder of police brutality, is quite invasive and can naturally make an impact on people's performance. And so not only should you be monitoring and making sure that you're accounting that in performance expectations, but at the same time, review and take time to assess your performance structure. Is it equitable? Are you being inclusive? Are there natural biases that are coming into performance conversations? Education. I think every company has the social responsibility to educate their employees during their tenure there. When you look at America, for example, many white Americans experience people of color and other minority groups at work more than they do in their everyday life. So there's a responsibility that companies have to create an environment that fosters belonging and inclusion and gets to the point of education and understanding and mutual respect for one another. So because of the fact that many white Americans are interacting more frequently with LGBTQ, Black, brown, Indigenous, and other people of color at work more than they are in their day-to-day lives, education is a crucial part of the DEI conversation that often gets overlooked or gets deprioritized due to funding. And then I think lastly, if you have essential workers, look at how DEI is playing a fact or how it's impacting your essential workers. Are a majority of your essential workers people of color or a part of a minority group? If so, how are you providing resources to them? How are you making sure that you're supporting those workers above all else? So I say there's 3 A's that you could do today at little to no cost. As often, in my experience, DEI gets deprioritized, not because that people don't see it as a priority, but because a lot of it, education, resources, performance, hiring, are seen as costly. And so I say oscillate, acknowledge, and audit. Those are the 3 A's that you really should do. Diagnose the problem, acknowledge where you failed in the past, and then do an audit of how to improve all of your processes in the future. And there's a lot of ways that you can support your marginalized groups in your organization during these crises. One is inclusive comms. Make sure that when you're articulating things about partners, that you're being inclusive in that. When you're speaking about gender, that you're not looking at it only in binary terms. Everything you say and everything you communicate to the company, you need to look at through the lens of how each marginalized group would be impacted by that communication or read into that communication. That really comes down to the second point, which is people first leadership. If you're leading with people first and you're thinking about each individual on your team and how they are impacted, and you're leading with the idea that you want to make an impact and make sure that they know that you are representing them, then this should not be an issue. Flexibility, I think one thing I've seen leaders do extremely well during this time is just really being transparent about what they know and what they don't know, and making sure that their comms and or their procedures and or the way that they're assessing the business is flexible. And they're showing that during this time of ambiguity, we are remaining flexible, and making sure that your employees know that they have the ability to have some flexibility in terms of work expectations, performance, time off, etc. And I think that goes into performance expectations, really setting what are you expecting and what are you not expecting from your team. You know, if your sales team is going out expecting the same sales goals that they were expecting prior to this economic uncertainty, you're not setting them up for success. So making sure that you're supporting those marginalized groups and people within your community by really setting what are the expectations that you're expecting of them in this given moment, and that you are allowing flexibility in those performance expectations. And then I think it's really important for us to address the health outcomes head on, particularly as it relates to the coverage that you're providing and the way in which your coverage helps dismantle that, or maybe doesn't impact your employees. I think is a very important aspect of the company, and really talk about those disparate health outcomes and why that's important to your company and how you're looking to overcome that in the policies, processes, and benefit offerings that you're going to put forward in the future. A lot of the focus when it comes to education, rightfully so in my opinion, is around unconscious bias and the topic of racism. But unconscious bias training alone is not enough, and it doesn't just check a box for years to come in terms of training. It's really the beginning of education, is accepting that you and I and everyone that's listening to this and everyone that you face in life has some sort of unconscious bias, whether they acknowledge it or not. But the topic of systemic racism is even more important to discuss, and oftentimes many people of color and or marginalized groups get frustrated that unconscious bias forgives systemic racism by its nature, because calling something unconscious means that there has been no systemic nature to it. And the fact is that in America specifically, there is systemic racism in our country, and it affects the way in which we operate our businesses, the way in which we see Black and brown talent, the way in which we assess performance, the way in which we see growth opportunities within companies, etc. So one thing I always say is that a prerequisite is not required for response. So one great example of that is many companies do not have trans employees because there aren't many in terms of demographic data, many out trans people in the workforce today, and particularly in the corporate environment. So not addressing trans issues just because you don't have an openly trans person at your workplace is not appropriate. You still should respond and or create policies and procedures that are inclusive to trans individuals, even if you don't have that prerequisite of an out and open trans employee. That employee should not have to be a pioneer pushing for these benefits, for these offerings at that point. The same goes for Black employees. If you don't have a huge group of Black employees, that doesn't mean you should not be responding to this moment, stating what you should and should not be doing moving forward, and the way in which you're embracing the Black community and addressing systemic racism. So that's a very important part. Do not allow the prerequisite not being there to be the excuse as to why you're not responding to a topic or an important call to action from your employees. 2, you need to have candid conversations. Talking about race is hard, and that's one reason why it's stigmatized in our country. But candid conversations are extremely important. 1, it's important that you set an expectation that intent is in the right place. So that way you give people permission to ask questions and try to educate. Now that said, people of color should not be expected to be the ones, because they have been expected to be the ones for some time, to be the one to educate. But questions are an extremely important factor into the education process and should be able to be asked somewhere. And so really creating a safe space where candid conversations can take place, and where you can, as a company or as a corporate leader, take in feedback in a candid way and say, look, I'm not going to judge you for what you say here. You can speak freely. It really allows the employees to offer input and guidance. Allyship is important as well, but you can't merely call allyship the idea that Black and brown or LGBTQ people exist. Allyship requires action. You have to become an advocate and eventually an activist if you commit to being an ally. And so it's really saying, I see that there is a problem, or I see that your community is in need, I want to help, and I want to fight for your community alongside your community and use my privilege to help your community, but I will become an activist. I will listen and I will know the limitations that come with me being an ally. As an ally to the Black community, I will never understand as a white cis queer person what it's like to be Black. And so there are certain limitations that my allyship provides. But saying I'm an ally means that I'm going to be marching, I'm going to be speaking up, and I'm going to use my white privilege as a man in society to really make sure that everything I do is centering and attempting to better the experience of Black and brown individuals in this country. Who have you not heard from? There are often loud voices in organizations, but oftentimes the quiet voices have so much to say and just for one reason or another are not saying it, or maybe they aren't given the opportunity to say it. So I often like to center my conversation as an HR professional on who have I not heard from and what am I attempting to center, or who am I attempting to center with this policy I'm creating or with this inclusive comms I'm trying to roll out. And then I go exactly to that community or to an individual at work that represents that community, and I ask them for feedback. I ask if they would like to offer any input. And that really allows for some people who often don't speak up and or maybe aren't in a position of power within the organization to speak up, to offer their input if they would like to. But I often lean in on it is not a requirement. I'm just opening up the opportunity for a candid conversation between us. And oftentimes, invisible diversities don't get covered in the diversity conversation, particularly disabled persons within the conversation. So I really wanted to pull that out here to just ensure that as we're talking about virtual working conditions, it's really important that we lean in on disabled persons and marginalized groups and how the virtual working condition, while very inclusive in nature, can also be not inclusive to some. So make sure that your policies and expectations are inclusive for all. You know, if you're saying that you want your team to work from 8 p.m. to 6 p.m. and they have kids at home that they're educating virtually, that's likely not possible. So just think through some of those situations. Ask employees what they need to be productive. If you have someone who has light sensitivity or screen sensitivity with their eyesight, they're likely not going to be able to be on Zoom all day long. And so making sure you're giving them tools, resources, buying them blue lens, eyewear if they need it, giving them, wrist support if they, have carpal tunnel. Just provide the resources that you can to make sure that people can be productive, but also stay healthy. And then again, look at your resources that you're providing and try to find ways in which, and highlight the ones that are virtual, teledoc services, remote tips, an EAP, anything that can be virtually assessed. Just remind people of it frequently, because oftentimes the one time that you look at benefits and perks at your organization is when you're starting at the company, and there's a lot going on that oftentimes you gloss over the things that you could be utilizing now, just by sheer nature of the volume of benefits and perks that most companies offer today. There are ways to increase allyship and understanding during this time. One way is employee resource groups, setting the expectation that the resource group is really a means of connection and community building amongst minority groups within your organization. And if you don't have employee resource groups, ask your employees what they would like from them and or what groups they would even like to establish. And I always teeter on, when you're really establishing these groups or when you're wanting to revitalize them, just keep leaning in on the fact that it's informal and that really it's a means of connection, and that it can be a regular cadence, and it fosters cross-team collaboration, and it increases allyship because allies can be a part of the employee resource groups. And really make sure that allies feel welcome in joining the employee resource groups, but understand that as an ally, there will be some activism or action required by joining those employee resource groups. You really have to be an ally and live that truth. And be comfortable talking about the difficult conversations that come up, or listening and hearing the difficult conversations that may come up in those communities. Lunch and learns are another great opportunity. During Pride, we do a lot of lunch and learns around kind of the history of Pride, topics around Stonewall, topics around Pride. We're a marketing company, so we talk about pride campaigns and the trends there. But there are tons of those that can continue throughout the year, and different marginalized groups. And if you give your employees of those groups the opportunity to do something and take ownership of something, more often than not, they're really going to thrive and take that on and really surprise you in terms of what they're able to turn out. And then centering exercises, really looking at your policies and processes often and seeing if you're centering allies, or are you centering the people that actually are a part of that community and a part of that experience. Like, are you in theory, your parental policies and processes, is that in theory welcoming to people that might want to become parents in the years to come? Or are real parents giving you great feedback about the maternity and paternity leave that you're offering, the fertility treatments you're offering, etc.? So really make sure that you're centering the group that's actually directly affected by that, and it's not just something an ally or something that someone who might want to be affected by that in the future is responding nicely to. There's a lot of processes that I mentioned earlier that you can audit and ask yourself, like, what's working, what's not. The hiring process is one of them, particularly as we're going remote. Zoom hiring is unique, and not having never met someone in person for a typical in-office culture is quite challenging. And so really asking yourself how you can shape that hiring process to make sure people are getting a sense of the culture, that people are understanding what you're trying to do, and that you really can assess their value while also keeping in mind their time. Since most people right now that are actively looking are looking because they might have been laid off or looking for work, it's really important to make that process more succinct, but also more adaptable to this remote environment. And the same goes for the onboarding process. But more importantly, make sure that your onboarding process is equitable to different teams, to different functions, and to different minority groups. And make sure that it's malleable. If a new parent is joining your team, make sure that your onboarding process takes into account the fact that they might need more breaks and might not be able to do like a typical sitting down from 8 to 5 right now. So just really making sure that your process is working for different groups and that it's an inclusive process. The same goes for performance reviews. Oftentimes I like to audit post-performance review and just look at the different demographic data within our company and see how different minority groups are tracking in our company. If I see that, at past companies, when I've seen that minority groups are tending to track lower in performance, oftentimes bias is coming into play. So I will reassess the types of questions we're asking, what we're assessing them for, how we're assessing them, to make sure that we remove as much bias from the performance process as possible. And then layoff conversations. Oftentimes layoffs are done on certain types of teams just due to performance or due to restructuring or lack of focus. The marketing team, for example, is often one that gets frequent turnover. So really you need to look at those layoff conversations and look at, how are minority groups affected? And if your minority groups primarily work, say, on engineering or on marketing, et cetera, and you're looking to lay off those teams, ask yourself why and if bias is coming into play in those conversations. And this is where I would typically open it up for a Q&A. Obviously, this is a virtual recording, so I won't do that today, but I wanted to thank you for taking the time to listen to me today and hear some of the ways in which I and others in the DEI space are working to prioritize this. It's important that we remember that while our country is facing an uncertain time, and while we might be having a painful reminder of the systemic racism that's in our country, we are, and companies have been, trending towards a more inclusive environment and really embracing authentic selves. There's a lot of work to be done, but I like to end on a positive note and say that the amazing work that companies are doing and the amazing call to action, more importantly, that employees are requiring their companies to do and demanding change is really inspiring to see. By 2050, many of us know that the minority in this country will collectively become the majority. So in the United States particularly, over 50% of our country will identify as a minority by 2050. So this is not a matter of changing for the sake of changing. Our corporate environment in the next 30 years will look very, very different. And I firmly believe that the companies that get diversity, equity, and inclusion right today will survive. The ones that don't, as Gen Z and Alpha generation and the generations to come continue to enter the workforce, they will not work at companies that do not fully embrace their identity and their understanding of the world and foster belonging in their community or in their workplace. And thus, those companies that do not tackle diversity and equity and inclusion today will fail. I see this as another global warming that our country is facing. We have a deadline of 2050. What will you do to make sure that we are tracking towards a better tomorrow for all of our marginalized groups and making a culture that is not only inclusive, but fosters belonging and celebrates people for the differences that they have? Thank you so much for joining.